Hello and welcome to High Point Music's Gear Reviews. I'm Lewis, and in today's episode I'm going to be showing you the King by Menatone. The King is short for the King of Brits, and it's based on a previous model made by Menatone that embodies quite a few of those great British sounding amplifiers. It's got a pretty crazy EQ section, lots of selections for picking drive and character of the pedal, so it'd be a great pedal if you're looking to up your game as far as amp sounds go. You can use it into a clean amp to get those dirty Marshall sounds and really start to stack sounds and get access to tones without having to purchase a whole amplifier to do so. So a really versatile tool for guitarists, particularly people playing in covers bands who need to be able to access a sound really quickly without getting too complicated of a setup. So let's have a look at it and see what it can do. Of course, my setup today is I'm playing my Fender Stratocaster straight into the input of the King. We're coming out of the King into our 2 Notes Clean, which is running the built-in 2 Notes cabinet simulation straight off to our Ableton session. My clean tone sounds like so. So let's get into it. We've got a few basic controls that many people would be fairly familiar with. Obviously our input and our output jacks are there. We've got our 9-volt DC connection here on the back. We've got our level control, which is our master volume. A drive control, which sets the character of the gain, and I'll explain that by showing you how it changes the sound a little bit later on. Our gain control, which is our overall amount of distortion. Our high control. So this is our high frequency treble response. We've got a sweepable mid section I'll talk about in a moment, and a low frequency control. The low frequency tends to shovel out some of that bottom end boominess, which is really great for tightening up, going from a more modern sound to a more vintage sound. And then we get into our mid-range. So we've got a sweepable mid-range here on this blue knob. From 0 to 5, it acts like a normal amplifier control, increasing your mid-range. The way it describes it is, as you go past the 12 o'clock position, you get a bypassing of the EQ range for the mids control. It's a little bit subtle, but it definitely adds some nice character. We then have a few ways to manipulate that mids control. We've got a modern and a vintage switch, which changes our mid-range response. And we've got this trim pot here that's marked 60s, 90s, and 70s. And that's moving the frequency point for that mid-range control around. So it allows us to change where that mid-range sits and allow us to access, again, some more modern or some more vintage sounds from that Marshall in a box style pedal. They have popular amps from all generations, so it's a pretty well covered set of controls. Let's jump in and have a look at what it sounds like. I think some of the best things to do for this one is to run through some of the suggested settings that they give in the manual, just to show you what the flavor of it can do. There are a lot of controls and connections on here to deep dive into, which we might get into a little bit later. If that's something you want to see quite specifically, leave a comment below and we'll tee it up. So first of all, let's jump into the first setting. So the first setting I'm going to have a look at from the suggestions is the Jcm800 setting. My first amplifier was a Jcm800, so I'm quite fond of these sounds. I've got my gain control at 3 o'clock, so reasonably high. It's a pretty popular amplifier for high gain. And just to start off with, I've got my high, mids, and low frequencies at 12 o'clock. The drive or the character control is set as per the suggestion at 12 o'clock. I'm on the modern setting of the EQ control, and I've got the tone control here sitting around at the 70s position. I'm going to sweep that around and see what sounds good. It is going to sit somewhere probably closer to the 90s, halfway through maybe it'll give us a bit of that sound. So let's dive in. Nice tight, crunchy tones. Super tight response. First thing I noticed on this particular setting is, without going crazy with the EQ controls, our gain is really responsive, and the amount of bottom end that we get coming through when you palm mute is really tight and really easy to control. If you're playing faster lines and faster palm muting stuff, it really makes a difference to keep your lines nice and articulated and clean. So I think that's pretty cool. Next up, we'll try some lead stuff on this setting. I love my neck pickup, as many of you will know. So it responds pretty well to picking dynamics, which I quite like. Let's have a look at what our high and low frequencies can do to that sound though. So we... That low all the way up sounds huge. Doesn't sound too muddy on the neck pickup, on the bridge. So it adds a nice amount of bottom end, but doesn't get too flabby, would be the word I would use to describe it, which is really important because you don't want to be counteracting what's going on between the bass guitar and the kick drum. Keeping that guitar nice and tight will mean it's really punchy, really easy to hear, and the sound guy's not going to have to chew tons of frequency out of it in a live setting to get you to be fitting in the spot in the mix. So I will push that low back. I did like it here at about that 11 o'clock position. Nice and tight and crisp. Just going to sweep through our mids now. So we start with it all the way down. You can hear the mids are getting really, really bright and present there. As I mentioned earlier, that 12 o'clock position is our maximum mids boost, so it's going to get pretty bright pretty quickly. So big shift in presence there, which is nice to hear. A really useful mid-range control, or a well-voiced mid-range control, can mean the difference between you being heard and not being heard. It's a great way to push your frequency response without being too loud as well. So I'm just going to dial that back a little bit. Again, about that 10 o'clock position. Sounded pretty good. And just go between the modern and the vintage. So you can hear that little bit of a shift in the mid response, which is kind of what I would expect from a modern and a vintage sound. Typically modern sounds are a little bit brighter, a little bit more bottom heavy, and don't have as much of a mid-range presence as some of the older guitar sounds do. Let's have a look at what the 60s, 70s and 90s settings sound like. Because that is mid-range bass, I'm going to set that back onto the modern. That's a very subtle change in the EQ. I'm not quite sure that's going to translate all the way through in the video, but with those EQ settings the way they are, maybe if we pull these down, we'll hear that a little bit more obviously. It's very subtle. Cool. That's a fairly useful setting, but it's only going to be really relevant on particular drive character settings and particular mid and low settings from what I can hear. Just shifting it a very subtle amount. A very useful control though. I'm glad it's not inside the pedal. The pedal does only have internal controls to set your output treble response so that you can make it not too bright for your amp. I'll show it in a photo right here. So you can see the two dip switches there that offer you a few positions of treble response. Cool. So that's our Jcm800 setting. Let's punch on through a couple more. So the next setting is what they call the rectifier or slow setting, based on either a Mesa Boogie or a Soldano amplifier. I've shifted our drive character all the way up. We're now on the modern switch here, and I've moved this mids control or EQ control up to the 90s sound. This is what we get. So you can hear that gain is a lot more mature. There's tons more of signal clipping there, and it's getting that really saturated sound coming through quite nicely. There's quite a bit more noise going on as well. So tons of sustain going on, and we'll sweep through that mid-range so you can just hear how much response that's actually affecting. So definitely that mid shift happening there really accents the sound of that Mesa Boogie or Soldano kind of modern metal sound. So the next setting I'm going to show you is their 60s blues breaker sound based on the JTM45. This is a much cleaner style Marshall based quite similarly on a Fender. So you're going to get a lot more top end response, and the EQ change is quite obvious as well. So definitely much lower range of gain, having our drive all the way down, and that brightness is definitely coming through, so I think that's a pretty cool representation of that amp. To be able to go from that modern rectifier sound all the way through to that 60s bluesbreaker sound is pretty impressive in one pedal, so I'm a big fan so far. Let's check out one more of these settings. So I've just jumped over to the setting for the 70s super lead. I pretty much couldn't resist the description of that sound. We've gone to our modern setting, we've pulled our 70s or our mid-range voicing down to the 70s position. We've still got our drive down pretty low though, so we might sweep that up and play with the gain a bit more and deal with that mid-range a little bit more as well. Sounds like a pretty good 70s lead tone to me. It's very bold, there's not a lot of gain going on, so there's not a lot of compression, you get good dynamic range with it. So I like the dynamic range in that. I think it's got a lot of room to move. Sounds great playing with your fingers as well. It's nice and bright sounding, but still has that change in tone. So that's a pretty good option to go to for that in between the bluesbreaker and those higher gain sounds that I was trying before. So the big change that we've had in these EQ sounds is moving that drive control around. It's really saturating the signal at the high level. So I just thought I'd play a little bit with that. Leave it with our highs, how I've found that I like it, which is pretty bright. The mids turned a fair way up because again, to me, that great Marshall sound is how present it can sound. And the lows I've got here at about that 9 o'clock position because it's pretty tight on the bottom end. Our gain is all the way up, so it'll be a pretty drastic change as soon as I push that drive. So let's see what it does. So as you can hear there, that pre-drive setting or the way it's characterizing that gain makes a pretty big difference to the sound. Before, when we had the drive control up here at about this 11 o'clock position, it was still pretty saturated, but with the drive all the way down, it dies off pretty quickly. And would be a really great way to get some of those cleaner tones, but just by dialing them down, pushing your master volume up. like so. Might not want that much high end or mids for something that clean and bright. So it definitely gets a lot of character at that low gain range. I wasn't quite expecting it to be that bright, but considering how much control you have over the high end frequency in the mid range, I probably shouldn't have been so surprised. If you're looking as a way to color your existing amp sounds, as you heard, as soon as I turned this off, you can hear how much thicker the clean setting is. So it does a really, really good job of reshaping your tone control. Almost a good way to give you a two clean tones or an alternative clean tone. Maybe you could do that kind of washed out thing, or maybe you need like a really bright trebly channel for a guitar that has particularly dark pickups, or a song that really needs your guitars to stand out. Or, like I would spend most of the first video doing, that high-end range of the gain and the drive controls, just mucking around with how you set those voicings between the 60s, 70s through to the 90s is a great way to get some amazing crunch tones as well. Again, gigging guitarists, people who are in pub bands, people who are in studios and don't need to carry all that gear around, the Menatones in particular, but this King pedal is really, really versatile. So I think it would be a great addition to anybody's guitar arsenal. Compact, seems really, really well built. And considering how much gain is going on, it's a pretty quiet pedal, which tells me that the internal circuitry and components have been selected pretty carefully. So that's our wrap up on the Menatone the King. If you're interested in checking one of these out, you can do so by following the links below. If you've enjoyed the video, don't forget to give us a like, a share, a subscribe, a thumbs up. Leave a comment below if you've got any suggestions or questions. If you want to see this in a different light, then you can let me know below. If you'd like to support us to continue putting out as much good quality content as often as you possibly can, you can head over to our Patreon and become one of our amazing, esteemed Patreon members as well. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.